Bienvenue, welcome back. People are moving in after a fantastic start of the session. I get to reintroduce myself. My name is Patrik Weydt. I'm a neurologist at the University Hospital in Bonn and the co-chair of the Huntington's Disease Network Executive Committee, and it's my great pleasure to introduce the next session. It's hard to believe, but we heard it this morning from Anne Rosser. It's been exactly 20 years since the beginning of our network, and so we were able to squeeze in a special session on the conception, birth, and toddler years of the European Huntington's Network. Okay, that's if you don't come in, these people come after you. As I said, it's unbelievable that the European Huntington's Network is already 20 years old. So it's an organism that we've all together created, and as they say, it takes a village to raise a child, and as representatives of this village, we've been very fortunate to be able to recruit 3 people that hardly need an introduction in this audience, to look back, to look at the present state, and to look at the future of our network. These are Patrik Brundin, who is currently a distinguished scientist and head of the PRED program at Roche. So he's in industry, but he has a very distinguished career as an academic neuroscientist and neurologist, translational neurologist. He was a professor in Lund, and then he was the, I think, founding director of the Andel Research Institute in the United States. Pertinent to his role here is that he organized the very first Gordon Conference, I think 2003, 2001, so we'll hear all about that, where the original idea of this network was set. The second speaker today will be Bernhard Landwehrmeyer, who I heard is already somewhere in the building, but he has already turned in his slides. He is current interim chair of neurology at the University Hospital in Ulm, and the original chair of the Huntington's Disease Network, so we will hear from him. And then we will hear from our own Anne Rosser, the outgoing chair of the European Huntington's Disease Network. So with that, I think we have enough time spent on the introduction. It's my pleasure, and please welcome with me Patrik Brundin.
So it's a great pleasure to stand here today and speak to you about the conception, birth, and the toddler years of the European Huntington's Disease Network. And as Patrik hinted, it started 20 years ago. But before I tell you about it, I don't have any real conflicts when it comes to this talk, because this is not about therapeutics. I work at Hoffmann La Roche, and I'm the movement disorders therapeutic area leader there. I also want to say, even if I don't have any conflicts of interest, I may have forgotten a name or a date here and there. 20 years is a long time. But this is the layout of my presentation. I will tell you about the conception of the network on a terrace in Tuscany on May 6th, Tuesday afternoon. And then the positive test result, which came in Manhattan a month later, as is appropriate. And then how we, during the toddler years, grew up and found our identity as a network. So this is the location where the European HD network was conceived, a beautiful place. It was actually the second Gordon Conference. I started the Gordon Conference series in Mount Holyoke in 2001, but this was the second one in 2003. And Jill and Mike Levine from the US were chairing this. And fortunately, they'd invited a couple of key players. Bernhard, whom you're going to meet. All of you met him sometime. He's next. And Elena Cattaneo, who I believe is not here, but has played an instrumental role in the network for many years. These were part of the scientific program, and that was fortunate. On the Tuesday, I was leading a discussion just before the lunch, and during that discussion on this Gordon Conference, we brought up the idea, wouldn't it be nice if we had something like the Americans, something a bit like the Huntington Study Group, or some way of gathering Huntington scientists, identifying families with mutations and patients, and trying to accelerate the research. Before I go to the next slide, look at the top of the slide. What was the topic already in 2003? Triplet repeat instability. So that was already a hot topic in 2003. But my little presentation was just before lunch, and we had our lunch, and we have free time in the afternoon. So what did we do? Well, since we were in this beautiful resort and spa, Il Choco, we went onto one of the terraces outside the restaurant. Up there on the picture, you can see many terraces. And it was a very, very hot afternoon. This is actually what the terrace looked like. I don't think we even had that pergola roof. It was very, very sweaty and hot. But we sat there and discussed how we could go about and do this. And we'd already talked about it a little bit before, but we were inspired by the heat and the beauty and very enthusiastic about this. But we had no resources. 2 days later, it was time for the leavers' dinner. It was celebrated with this beautiful cake, and those of you who have good eyesight can see at the very back, there's Nancy Wexler. We got Anne Young closer to us in this picture. We were celebrating the triplet repeat, CAG triplet repeat Gordon Conference final dinner. And of course, Bernhard networked with Jill, and I networked with Elena, and we were talking about this possibility. And I was fortunate, by chance, to end up at a table next to Ethan Singer and Roby Blumenstein, who's here, who were then with the HiQ Foundation. And they said, what are you guys thinking about in Europe? It sounds really interesting. So they really thought this was something that could perhaps be coordinated together with North American efforts. And I was excited by this. And this, you know, I came home to Sweden. And what happened when I came home to Sweden? Well, I had to go to my old backup hard disks. Here's some of them. Try to find cables, to find the correspondence. This is what it looked like, because the email programs are different, and I have spent weeks now decoding the messages. And there was one very important message from Roby on May 19th, where he wrote, "It was great to meet you at the conference. We're extremely interested in following up on your idea for a coordinated European HD initiative." And this idea, I point out, we were many people on that terrace who had it jointly, but Roby wrote to me, and you know, sometimes you want to play hard to get, so I'm sure I really wanted to type back to Roby immediately, but I delayed it a little bit, and this is authentic. This is now 200 hours. It's in the evening. I waited a little bit. Didn't want to seem too enthusiastic, and I wrote, "Likewise, I was delighted with our interaction at the Gordon Conference. We've already decided to have a one-day meeting at a Paris airport 12 days from now. And we had an executive board of a European collaboration that had no funding, but we did meet in Paris at an airport. And you can see here are the characters. It was Mark Peshansky, Elena, Raymond Roos, whom you all know, Jill, Bernhard, myself. That little pig there in the middle, you may wonder what it is. I was traveling around with a Swedish Christmas decoration to every conference in 2003. I was inspired by this French movie where she traveled around with a garden gnome. And I took pictures of this Christmas decoration in many, many cities around the world. So there we sat, and I quickly, when I came home, now I really wanted to be in touch with Roby, so at 9:42 in the evening I wrote, "I'm back from Paris. We had an excellent meeting today." regarding participation in a meeting in the US on June 17th, which we'd been told about, Bernhard is able to come. If it's possible for me to come too, just for 1 or 2 days possibly, without a frightfully expensive ticket, I would like to come too. So I wanted to join Bernhard on this trip, and we had a lot of momentum. We're enthusiastic. So let's keep this ball rolling. Roby invited us, and we ended up in a North American meeting, and I found the protocol from the meeting, and it says, our European colleagues now joining us. But this was the North American, US and Canadian network. So this was exciting. Roby knew that both Bernhard and I were jet lagged because we come from Europe. So he suggested, let's meet really early before this high Q program starts its meeting. Let's meet at 5:30 a.m. We were in a very nice hotel, which no longer exists, the W Court Hotel. And that hotel didn't have breakfast at 5:30. So instead, we had to go across the street, and this is where we're not quite sure where we were, but it was some kind of seedy sort of Manhattan diner with red glossy seats, and we sat there together. And this was a milestone, because at this meeting, Bernhard, myself, and Roby, we heard Roby say, yes, we will fund what was then called the EHDN network. So the outcome of that event on the terrace in Italy, in Tuscany, finally was positive. We then, by the way, this is sort of a diversion. I'm in this hotel, and most of you probably are. This morning I went up for breakfast early because I'm jet-lagged. I live in the States now, and I'm jet-lagged in the other direction. But I went up and had breakfast at 6:30. It's a deserted breakfast room, nobody else except with this one lonely man sitting by the window. Isn't that odd? So, Roby, should we make another movie like Julie Depley and Ethan Hawke, where you meet every 10 years? You know, the one before sunset, before sunrise, before midnight? But that's odd. So what happened after this meeting? Well, we were very enthusiastic that there was money, and this is how I presented the whole thing in Sweden. At an internal meeting, I talked about an exciting project, and our mission statement, it wasn't really set in October. We had this vague idea of how we were going to work, and we were going to facilitate biomarkers and try to develop or facilitate the development of new therapies and interact with science and clinicians. But we had to grow up. This was too unclear. We had some idea of the direction. We had to find an identity. So that's why I'm going to describe now, for the next few slides, how a toddler develops. And no scientific presentation today should come without artificial intelligence, and you see this is an AI overview of toddler development. So thank you, Google. So this is the first part. Infants form special relationships with family members and learn to trust the world around them. They may be clingy and wary of strangers. Well, that's, in our words, called the board of directors. So this is actually the formed board of directors, and Ann-Katrine Bashir-Levy is there. Husto, I don't believe, is here today, but we were the core, and we had Roby also as a distant member of the board. And we had some idea of how we were going to work together, and we wrote this in Word documents. Remember, 2003, there was no Zoom or Google Meet. You had to travel. We had to book a conference call on a telephone. It was awfully complicated. We didn't even have smartphones. So we started doing this, and we then became more physically active, explored new objects, and moved around, and in our case, moving around, because we couldn't Zoom. We went to many European cities. We went to Milan, outside Madrid, Paris, outside Paris, Créteil, Leiden, and Roby would sometimes come. We'd talk about biomarkers and biobanking with Coriel, if we were going to do that, databases, governance, kind of nuts and boltsy stuff, translation of scales, languages. Alan Tobin would come to that Paris meeting on biomarkers. So still very much early. we would engage back and forth and play with others. We even played with people on the other side of the Atlantic. We wanted to be part of an NH grant proposal, as is written in this phone meeting minutes. So we wanted to get closer very early on here in 2004 with the North American initiative. But as toddlers learn to express themselves, they'll sometimes share how they feel through laughter or through temper tantrums. And I shall not pretend that everything was always smooth sailing. And this is an authentic email. I will not say who sent it, but you may guess. It says, Il Choco Redux is the theme. It's not that there's disagreement, but rather a lack of consensus. I'm not quite sure what the difference is there, actually. But it's a political way of saying, we don't quite agree, but let's not get upset. So we, in 2004, in November, said, let's revisit the terrace of Il Choco conceptually. Let's now write down a formal governance and figure out how we should work. So this was, and there's Anne-Katrine, I haven't seen you for many years. You remember these emails, I know you responded to them. And somebody else who responded anonymously said, we're supposed to meet again. It's been suggested London, but there's warmer and sunnier places than London. The warmest place in the United Kingdom is the Canary Islands, and the warmest place of Germany is Mallorca. You can guess who wrote this. So you saw the temper tantrum and also the laughter. We had some fun, even though this was an intense period. So, toddlers understand words and commands. Now we're getting more advanced in the development, and they can recognize names of people and familiar objects. And this means they can write a governance. 140 plus slides at the Leiden meeting in February 2006 detailed how we were going to govern what was called the Euro Huntington's Disease Network. One of the first things we did there, we changed it to the European Huntington's Disease Network. A euro had just been introduced, actually, a couple of years before, and it sounded a little bit seedy. It's like you wouldn't have the dollar Huntington's Disease Network. Euro is a monetary unit. So it was the European network was defined here. And I'll just highlight another couple of things. You know, we wanted to work towards a cure, but we needed knowledge, we needed drugs, trials, collaboration. So the aim was to cure Huntington's disease, but a network can't just work with that. So we decided we should improve the understanding and the treatment of Huntington's. And now that I work in industry, I realize how important this was, because the actual development of therapies is a completely different ballgame that requires different people and skill sets and capacities. But understanding the disease and facilitating the trials is incredibly powerful and one of the great strengths of the European Huntington's Disease Network. So now, finally, for the last minute, the concept of separation. Åsa Petersen was sitting here earlier today, and Maria Björkqvist, I just met Maria. They were the next generation in Lund. Here they are with Hindrik Mulder, who was Maria's postdoc supervisor at the time. Together we joined and formed or organized a biomarker meeting in Lund under the European HD network framework in May 2006. So I was seeing the next generation was already arriving. And we had this wonderful dinner in a castle just outside Lund University, Trollholm Slott. And in this castle, we had food and some people had drink. And we discussed Huntington's disease. And I saw something happening. I saw the new generation appearing even more in this castle. I saw young people who had not been in Italy, who were now shaping the future of the European HD network. Ed Wild became a powerhouse. I also saw another young person who remains young today magically, who's opening new doors. Sarah found out in the castle that some of the doors in that castle led to brick walls. Just like in science, we open new doors and sometimes we don't get anywhere, but at least we tried. So that is all about research and developing new therapies. So, the baby might be clinging wary, and they might be worried about you leaving them, but my wife and I were expecting our first child in September 2006, and I gradually did a conscious uncoupling from the network and focused on Parkinson's disease for some years because I simply didn't have time. And I knew it was in very, very good hands. And remember, we used to be 5, 6 people meeting at the Paris airport. I'm delighted to see how many people are part of this European network today. So to summarize the early years, I don't have much time, so I'll refer you to the movie about the early years, which is called Under the Tuscan Sun, which, was released in 2003. And, the movie says, life offers you 1,000 chances. All you have to do is take one. And the other message, Patrik, you stole it already, it takes a village to raise a child. Nobody's raised this child more than our next speaker, Bernhard. I believe you are next on stage. So with this, I hand over the child to you at 3 years.
Thanks. Great. Terrific. So thanks, Patrik, and thanks to both Patriks sitting next to each other for a very nice introduction. So what I am now going to focus on, slightly different from what Patrik was portraying to you, are the concepts and the ideas that guided EHDN in conception, during pregnancy. We heard about this. Was, by the way, a longer pregnancy than 9 months, and during the formative years. And it is characterized by expansion, dynamic expansion, with, and that's in question mark, potentially with some instability as well. Very fitting to what we are talking about, an unstable dynamic expansion mutation. So this is 10 years, and you saw in the slides of Patrik that the 10 years anniversary of the discovery of the gene was remembered in a cake format at the time. And so 10 years after the identification of the HD gene, we got together, and that seems to be a pattern. Every 10 years, big things happen. If you go back, in 1983, the HD gene was linked to chromosome 4 by Jim Gusella, 2 years later to the short arm of chromosome 4. 10 years later, the HD gene in the expansion mutation was identified. And in the same year, the HSG was formed. Very appropriate, given that at the time, the feeling was the cure is around the corner, which turned out to be a somewhat longer path. 10 years later, PREDICT started, and that's a little bit tongue in the cheek, the conception of EHDN and El Choco. We actually started with our first studies 1 year later, so it doesn't quite fit the pattern, with the first plenary meeting in Spain, in Guadarrama, and the first natural history study on a registry that was started at the time. In 2013, again, 10 years later, I tweaked the history here a little bit. I was referring to the first European participant, the actual first participant, was enrolled in Tennessee in July 25th, so in the States. But still, it makes a pattern, and somewhat arbitrarily, I highlighted this as a next big step forward. And I would like to stress, as Patrik did, that EHDN was conceived as a basic science meeting. And I think that's important for the spirit in which I hope until today EHDN is working. Alexandra, who was there, Marie-Françoise Chesley, under the chairmanship of Nancy Wexler, had a joint session at the time. And Patrik pinpointed the likely conceptual date, May 6th of, not 2023, that's wrong, but May 6, 2003. At lunch, so we know it was noon. That's very precise for conception, isn't it? Normally you don't know that. So the point that I would like to make is that EHDN is firmly grounded in science and on science. And all the translational and therapeutic efforts that we are conducting are on this foundation. And therefore, like in the very beginning, it is reliant on an ongoing, constantly updated interaction and exchange between scientists of all flavors, basic scientists, translational scientists, and clinical scientists, and, very importantly, obviously, the families affected. At this time, at El Choco, 10 years after the identification of the EHD Huntington gene, it felt right to move towards treatments. Cure is a big word, but to treatments that make a difference for HD. Having identified some targets, but not yet having the tools to hit these targets, developed in a systematic fashion. And various Cure HD initiatives were discussed. A year before, HiQ Foundation was established and incorporated in 2003, with the aim of speeding up target identification. At that time, in Europe, two approaches towards clinical treatment options emerged and made their way into the clinics: the excitotoxicity camp and the transplantation camp, if I may summarize that way. The excitotoxicity camp, inspired, for instance, by Anne Young and others, and Roger Albin, translated into a study motivated by the impact that ribosol has, limited though it is, in ALS, and the first study was conducted. The transplant camp had impressive science to show, Stefan Palfi, Marc Bishansky, Philippe Entrey, and others. In Cardiff, Anne Rosser and Steve Dunnett worked towards the same aim, reviewed this carefully, and Anne-Catherine Bachot-Lévy presented a first clinical study suggesting impact, motor and cognitive improvement in patients with fetal neuronal transplant. Summarized by Mark in Brain that year, a year after the conception of EHDN. So it's not by chance, you have seen the picture before, that there are those folks here. This is Marc Bishansky. Can you see my cursor? I guess you cannot. I'll try again. Oops. And Mark is on the very left, and it's very impolite, I realized, looking at the picture. The two women standing. Isn't that impossible? Very inconsiderate. And it's interesting to look at the pedigree. Elena Cattaneo, some transplant background, but in between. Patrik, from his own upbringing in Lund, working with Anders Bergqvist, transplant influence as well, no question. And Raymond, working together with Anne, with others, in between, Jill, and I think more towards the other camp, if you like, a nice combination of the efforts that were present at the time. The most important thing, and I think that was the critical component for at the time HiQ Foundation, was that the transplant effort and the riluzole efforts combined showed and demonstrated that there is a real benefit, tangible benefit, in working together clinically, and that it's feasible in clinical networks spanning all the diverse European countries to conduct randomized clinical trials in Europe. I told you that in 1993 the HSG was formed. And at the time, by Ira Schulzen, who sadly passed away this year, and Jack Penny at the time, who already passed away in the 90s. This organization, HSG, was a big inspiration for us. And although the HSG is inclusive and has some European members, there were challenges, language and the like, that needed to be overcome in the European context and that we need to address specifically using native speakers in the various countries, language area coordinators, to address that issue. HSG was a big inspiration for us. And from, if I may say so, from an Irish perspective, we were the little ones, who, in a nice way. And it was very stimulating, but the connotation at times was, they try. And which is inspiring, and to be challenged, to be up to your best, and by a very established senior colleague was an inspiration. What we needed to do, most of all, and this is, I think, the most important concept on which EHDN is founded, is one thing: trust. I show you here George P. Shultz. Many of you remember George P. Shultz. He was Secretary of State and lived to be 100 years of age. And he wrote in the Washington Post in December 2020, when he turned 100, a sum up of his 100 years of experience as a diplomat. And the most important message, and I think it does apply to EHDN for sure, is when trust is in the room, whatever room that is, good things happen. It was important to build that trust. I told you there were camps. There were some controversy. My recollection is that some of our colleagues more engaged in the transplant field said, why do we need a new organization? We have one. It's developing. We had others who said, well, let's wait and see. Is this going to stay? Is this going to develop for real? Meeting up with people in all locations was critical to form trust. And trust is the foundation for proper collaboration. Now, collaboration with the Huntington disease associations, with sites, with basic scientists, very important. We are in for this together. We got structure. Patrik alluded to it. Very important for trust and for proper collaboration. We need a proper, well-defined, written-up structure to do this. And we needed to work on shared things. like the natural history study preceding an Enroll-HD registry, working together on a common, towards a common objective and on a common shared project was critical for the life of EHDN. And at some point, we reached critical mass. And the best example from my perspective for critical mass is the enormous insights that were gained from looking at the genetic modifiers for Huntington's disease. That's, of course, a global effort by now, not only confined to Europe, but with an important European contribution. What we do is something that has an objective, an end. We are providing hope by our research effort, by experimental therapies for tomorrow, but we need at the same time to provide help, concrete help for the families affected, and both is the mission of EHDN. And we are not done yet. Currently, there is not yet a disease-modifying treatment established 31 years after identifying a single gene with a single type of mutation. And you are working towards this. And Anne will address the question of how EHDN is preparing for the future in the talk that is going to follow mine. Let me close with a brief personal note. Helping to develop and mature EHDN required some, you can read it, it's raining, some audacity and the ability to take power naps. Thank you very much. So, the future is getting on the stage.
So, thank you. I'm going to use this microphone because there are only 2 headsets and our 2 Madonnas have used them already. So, as Bernhard said, I'm going to be talking about early adulthood. We're 20 years old now. So what's happening in EHDN and what can we think looking ahead? So I just want to thank Bernhard and Patrik for those fantastic presentations. Here they are at the beginning of the network. And here they are now, and I think you can see they're just as lovely and vibrant as they were 20 years ago. But of course, things change, we all change, and it's important when you reach adulthood. It takes enterprise for a young adult to accomplish their many responsibilities, finding a home and a mate, establishing a family, which Patrik's obviously done in spades. And so EHDN has had to evolve. And one real precipitant to this, of course, is that the landscape that we're in now has changed quite dramatically over the years since EHDN was first conceived and birthed. And just to give you a very quick flavour of this, these are some fragments taken from early plenary programmes, and you can see that in the early years we were thinking a lot about the phenotype of Huntington's, and that's where, to some extent, registry grew from. I really like this one in 2005. Leslie Jones and Marcy MacDonald were asking the question, genetic modifiers in HD, is it worth looking? are we ready in 2004? Are we ready for clinical trials? We weren't doing clinical trials at this point in HD in an interventional sense. And even in 2014, in a session thinking about Huntington lowering, the question was, well, how do we take the first steps into clinical trials? So things have changed a lot over the last 20 years. So we now know so much more about the mutant protein, what it does, the importance of the exon 1 fragment. We have Huntington lowering trials in abundance. It turned out that looking for gene modifiers was worth doing, and indeed this has now spawned a whole new field and is extremely likely to lead to new treatments. There have been many animal models developed over this period of time, and also importantly, we think about the whole journey of Huntington's disease in a different way to the way we thought about it right at the beginning of the network. And of course, one product of this is the new staging system, the HDISS. And this is also just showing you some of the clinical trials that the network has been involved in over the last 20 years. And what you can see from this is, first of all, that there are many more clinical trials now, and quite a lot of these have come into being over the last 5 to 10 years. A lot of them now are really focused on potential disease modifiers, and all the ones highlighted in yellow are Huntington lowering studies. So, again, things have changed hugely. So how has EHDN evolved to try and keep up with this, and how are we looking towards the future? So obviously this can't be exhaustive because I don't have that long, but I just want to mention a few things, and one is the EHDN think tank. And this is the brainchild of Jean-Marc Burgunder, who was the previous chair. He was chair between myself and Bernhard. And this was really Jean-Marc's brainchild, sorry for the unintended pun. And the think tank itself has evolved over time. It came together as part of the first revision of the EHDN scientific strategy in 2017, and it's a group of people who meet frequently to discuss a range of issues and oversee working groups, and so it's a real workhorse for EHDN. So I think this has been a really useful development, and you can see here the think tank meeting we had yesterday. Another new activity is advanced therapies, thinking about advanced therapies. So clearly quite a lot of disease-modifying treatments are advanced therapies. They're gene or cell therapies. And these are quite difficult therapies to take through to clinical trial. There are lots of challenges. And so we've set up a working group that's now been running for about 5 to 7 years to try and bring together knowledge and understanding about how to do these trials in the best possible way. And that itself has spawned a number of groups. So a task force looking at the neurosurgical challenges, a new one looking at cell production, animal models, how we use them and how we can provide better guidance. And the newest of these is the clinical trial design task force, which really came together in Palm Springs this year, and we had a second meeting yesterday. Another way that we're preparing for the future is thinking about how we can access post-mortem brain tissue for clinical research. And of course, We've been accessing brain tissue through various generous gifts from families for many years, but there is a huge need to really be able to look at Huntington's at the very earliest stages. This is an extremely difficult thing to do. This is very much planting trees for the future, but this is another initiative that started up recently, and this is the first meeting which took place in London a few months ago, led by Ed Wild. Another sign of how EHDN is changing and moving forward is the fact that we now have a regulatory science group. So we're really in a position now where we need to start to think about how we interact with the regulators. And this is very much in collaboration with CHDI. Again, it's an initiative that has really started very recently. It's going to allow us to formulate questions and develop guidance. And the starting project is to try and raise awareness and seek resolutions for how we move forward with the new staging scale, the HDISS. Of course, it's also important to continue to stimulate knowledge exchange, collaboration and discussion, something that both Patrik and Bernhard talked about and something that EHDN has always done. And in the pandemic, we learned an awful lot about how to communicate through video platforms, which sometimes were quite trying, but have also been a fantastic tool. This is we had a whole meeting in 2020, which you may remember, which took place on Zoom. And we've used this to good effect. So last year there was a working group forum bringing all the working groups together. We had a fantastic discussion, and there have been a number of new initiatives that have grown out of that. And we've also started a series of platform meetings to try and give the opportunity for the membership to come together in between these sorts of meetings and debate hot topics and things that may be of particular interest or controversial moving forward. Bernhard mentioned partnerships, and of course, as you grow and develop, partnerships are really important. We've got quite a long-standing partnership with MDS. We run our fellowship programme with them jointly, and that's been very successful. Bernhard already mentioned our long relationship with HSG. We're developing a new relationship with the European Reference Network. This is still in its infancy, but again, I think is going to be really useful moving forward. And of course, of huge importance is our relationship with the lay bodies and with families. This is really core to our existence and what we're here for. So in the very beginning, EHDN very much partnered with EHA, and I'm very pleased to say that that's been a very fruitful and is an ongoing partnership. But we're now spreading our wings and developing partnerships more broadly, and a good example of that is HDO, and I'm sure you heard the fantastic presentation from a HDO ambassador this morning. So this is going to be of special importance as we move forward, and we're doing trials at earlier and earlier stages of the disease to really engage with the patients and families. And of course, over the years, as we've stepped into the realm of doing more interventional trials, we've formed relationships with many companies, and these are down here are sponsors for this meeting. And this has proven to be very fruitful and fantastic. And we're so pleased that the sponsors regularly come to these meetings. And as we grow and move, of course, there's also a need sometimes to revisit things that we put together in the past and were highly successful. Bernhard showed a version of this map in his presentation. And we're in a process, undergoing a process now of going back to our centres. The centres have changed over the years. Some centres have newly evolved, some centres are no longer active, but most centres are still there, but they're not quite the same as they were 20 years ago. And so we're going back on a one-to-one basis to try and understand better what our centres are doing and what the resources are that exist within the European network. And finally, of course, we've got to plan for success, because I think we're moving into an era where there will be successes, and we don't exactly know what they look like. But the Heated Task Force is very much focused on this. That's run by Hugh Rickards, and this is a task force that's been in place for some time, but I think is about to relaunch. And we will have to think about treatments as they become available and as they become licensed. We'll have to take some hard decisions and think about this in a holistic way. And we can learn a lot from other diseases. And for example, the lecanemab story that many of you will be familiar with currently for Alzheimer's disease. So finally, I just want to come back to say a few thanks. We've heard a lot about CHDI and their part in this. And of course, this network simply wouldn't be here without CHDI. There are many, many people from CHDI who come to these meetings, and we're really very much enjoy the interactions we have. I've just picked out a few here. Roby, you've heard mentioned a number of times already, and Roby has been a very caring parent over a lot of years. He comes annually to, well, not annually, he comes to every executive meeting, all the way from the US, and he's here sitting looking slightly pensive next to Robert Sitterby. Emily Gampman has now joined Roby in coming to our meetings. And I also wanted to highlight Christina Sampaio, who's been increasingly involved in a number of our new initiatives over the last couple of years. But I think it's also really important to stress that although we wouldn't be here without CHDI, we also wouldn't be here without the unbelievable commitment and enthusiasm from our members. And by members, I mean everybody from people who are working in care right through to fundamental scientists and all the family members who are here and come to these meetings and are part of our activities. So I think this is terrifically important, and we are really grateful for your ongoing enthusiasm. And just to finish, to say, I think there's a lot of pure joy involved in being involved in EHDN. We know how to party, and I hope that joy and that enthusiasm continues for many years.
This is right. So, wonderful presentation. Thank you, everybody. This raises, of course, a lot of questions. The most important is, how come you haven't changed over the last 20 years? So this was pretty amazing to see all these pictures. With that, I close this session and remind you, as Anne said in her introductory talk, to mingle and interact. This is what makes this community. There will be a party, so you have opportunity for that. But the first opportunity is the coffee break that we have now. So thank you very much.